So I'll just screen share now. Many of you will know Regional Development Australia, but for those of you who don't and maybe not familiar with our region here, I'd just like to introduce that we are part of a national program of 52 RDAs across the country, funded by the Australian Government and working for the Government of the day. And in Queensland, we have 12 RDAs. We all operate as incorporated not-for-profit associations. We in our region cover a very large part of Queensland, about a quarter of Queensland, and 15 local government areas. Importantly for today's focus being on mining and manufacturing in particular as part of our target zone, I do recognise that mining is a very significant industry in our region, accounting for 22% of GRP, centred around, of course, Mount Isa and Cloncurry in the Northwest Minerals Province as one of the world's richest mineral producing areas containing copper, lead and zinc, as well as silver, phosphate and rare earths. Also recognising we have a very strong gold mining area around Charters Towers region. So it is a very important sector to us. Also, the manufacturing sector accounts for nearly 7% of our GRP. And while some of that is heavily weighted towards the minerals processing, sugar production, and the agricultural and mining related processing, we do have an ever increasing and strong advanced manufacturing sector, which I'd like to acknowledge. And we've seen some great innovation in the region and lots of great opportunities for manufacturing going forward. So it's great to be able to focus on those two industries today. But of course, we welcome people from multiple industries that will also be no doubt interested in the NAIF updates. For your information, yesterday we also held an agricultural webinar, and with that webinar, it will, like this one, be recorded and loaded up online later today. Also, Jared's kindly going to take lots of questions at the end. So if you use the question and answer functionality at the bottom of your screen, we'll moderate those questions at the end and make sure we get back to you, all of you, with any questions that you raise. If you're not familiar with the Zoom webinar functionality, if you hover your mouse or your cursor towards the bottom of the screen, a bar should arise where you can see the opportunity to add in your questions. So we'll look forward to seeing those and responding to those at the end. In terms of other information about RDA, we do operate under a 4-point charter from the that's part of our funding agreement with the Australian Government. And as you can see, it very much focuses on facilitating and advocating for economic development within our regions. And we also collaborate closely with colleagues across the north of Queensland and Northern Australia as well. In terms of some of our other projects that stand, almost standalone projects that focus on economic development, most recently we've delivered an economic recovery and growth strategy and made sure we've briefed federal and state government representatives on that, and that's an ongoing process to come out of the drought, the flood and the COVID impacts our region has experienced, with some good sight on where the opportunities are going forward. And many of you who have worked with us over the years will also know we've been involved in road infrastructure funding advocacy, also a Building Jobs in Northern Queensland project that aligns with the civil construction sector, advocating for the skills we need of the future through a STEM Booster initiative, and also work on the aviation industry development and opportunities, noting that we have the Boeing drone test facility out in Cloncurry as a great example of the opportunities our region holds. So without further ado now, I'd like to be able to introduce you to Jared Painter, who's joining us today from Canberra. Yesterday he was with us from Brisbane. He gets around as he needs to in his job, and we're delighted that he'll be able to take us through the NAIF as an organisation, but importantly their focus areas and what we need to know about the future. So Jared, I'm going to stop sharing my presentation and hand over to you now to present us yours.
Well, thank you very much, Gladys, and thank you for putting on this morning's session. Thank you everyone for attending. And Gladys, if I could also say thank you very much for your support through the process of the NAIF reforms. I know the RDA has been pivotal in providing advice to both the statutory review and also other structures which have led to these reforms. So in many ways, I think this is the result of a lot of very good work from a lot of very good people, including yourself. So thank you very much for that. Everybody, I'm going to go through a presentation which will start with, I suppose, just some basic points around NAIF as it is and NAIF's purpose and goals. And then after setting that scene, I'll talk about the NAIF reforms. For people's information, I'm in Canberra today. I'm normally based in Cairns, as Glenys alluded to. The legislation which underscores these reforms will be voted on in the House of Representatives tomorrow. It will then go to the Senate with the ambition, which I think will be fulfilled, because both sides of Parliament seem to be very supportive of these changes, that it will be effective by 30 June of this year. So we're talking about things which are very much current, very much going to have an impact on Northern Australia. And as a NAIF employee, I'm working feverishly not only on the reforms, but actually how to operationalise these reforms. So I would appreciate feedback from people as we go through these changes, how they might see them applying to them, or different ideas about how they might be able to develop Northern Australia. So again, thank you all, and I'll just screen share the presentation now. Oops, work. As Glenys did, I'd like to begin my presentation with acknowledging the traditional owners of the countries throughout Australia, and in our case, throughout Northern Australia in which we operate, and acknowledging their continuing connection to the land, sea and community, and pay respects to their elders past and present. NAIF was put together after the 2005 white paper into the development of Northern Australia, and is the key instrument which is part of the federal government's Northern Australia policy focus. Our goal and mission is to generate transformational growth for Northern Australia through being an innovative financing partner. We have a key focus on financing that drives public benefit, economic and population growth, and Indigenous development in Northern Australia. Importantly, Northern Australia is defined, we'll just get to the screen here. Northern Australia is defined as mostly those areas which sit above the Tropic of Capricorn. There are some very notable exceptions. One is Gladstone, which is very important to us because it lips down and catches what is a great industrial city of Northern Australia. There are also a number of local government areas where a little bit of it comes over the Tropic of Capricorn. They're included as well. And for ease, all of the Northern Territory is included in the NAIF mandate area. So obviously the parts covered by this RDA, very much the heartland of NAIF and what NAIF's mission is about. Just some very simple notes on this slide. Firstly, we'll start in 2016. We'll be extended out to 2026 as part of this legislation. We were originally provided with $5 billion in capital, which was to be dispersed as debt in either senior or subordinated debt. And again, our focus is on a whole range of things, but importantly, it's about public benefit and Indigenous engagement and outcomes. How do we act as an innovative financing partner in this space? Well, we have a number of tools, but those tools come basically from the way in which we are structured, or where at least our capital comes from. We effectively borrow at the same rate and in the same terms as the Commonwealth Government. Effectively, when we have a transaction, what we do is we go to the Department of Finance and they add a bit extra to the government's borrowing at that time. So in theory, we could borrow for 30 years and we borrow at basically the bank rate, at the federal government borrowing rate for 30 years, 30-year bond rate. So that means that we can offer a longer tenor. We've never done 30 years, but we've done a number of transactions at 20 and 15 years, which is longer than what proponents would find from commercial banks in those situations. Because we've got so much time, we can provide and we can tailor the way in which repayment and amortization and interest is charged, because we can give a bit of a holiday up front, but we'll capture it towards the end. For many projects, as they ramp up, that's seen as a really valuable tool. So we can tailor amortization and repayment, mostly by trying to make it a bit easier at the beginning and capture more of it at the end because of the longer time. It is fixed rate lending. So in this period of lower interest rates, we can give you a longer tenor loan, or a project, a longer tenor loan at these lower interest rates, which again provides some certainty for proponents going forward. We do offer concessional interest rates. One thing I say about that at the moment is that's probably the least interesting of the structures that we can do, or at least what we can offer. And the reason for that is that everyone's getting lower interest rates now, so it's less of a difference to be borrowing at the Commonwealth rate. However, it's still there, and it's still quite useful. And if you can fix it for a longer period of time, it does provide that extra piece of certainty. Finally, we have a different view of risk to a commercial lender. So we're happy to be subordinated if other commercial lenders can be attracted to the transaction. In fact, we would like that. We would have a great preference for the private sector to come in and fill gaps rather than us doing that. So if we can crowd in those investors, we would consider that a mission accomplished. One point that I'd make about this slide on tools is that what we try and do is offer the proponent the tool that helps them most get the project up and running. So it's very rare that you get all the tools used on a project. What more than likely happens is you get a tailored solution using one or maybe two of the tools, which gets you to a point where your model holds up or is supplemented, or just some of the issues you get from operating in Northern Australia, which is distance, which can be, some of the issues about getting people to site and all those sorts of challenges can be dealt with by cheaper interest rate or a longer tenor or something on those lines. So we try and tailor every structure for every different project. How have we gone? Well, right at this point in time, out of that $5 billion, there's $2.7 billion which has been allocated to projects. Our process sees the board make an approval, which we call an investment decision. That investment decision is what I like to think of is where the money has effectively been offered to the other party, to the proponent. After that, the minister gets to have a look at it, and if he wishes to, if it wasn't consistent with government policy, he does have the option to, has a veto option, never been exercised because we make sure that we are on top of that before it gets to the minister's office. But there's a few on the minister's desk which will get us over $3 billion when they come through the system. There's $1.2 billion of those transactions which have reached contractual close. So after we've offered the money, obviously there's a few conditions that the proponent would have to meet. Once those conditions are met, we get to a situation where we sign a contract and we are contractually obliged to supply the funding to the project. And obviously the proponent is contractually obliged to deliver that project in line with the terms and conditions required by NAIF. What that's led to, guys, is last year in 2020, we had a very strong year. We had 9 investment decisions and 10 contractual closes. That leads to 23 investment decisions in total, of which Queensland and WA have roughly $1 billion each. And then we've got close to 700 million that's gone to the Northern Territory. And that's led to considerable amounts of public benefit and project value, which is obviously the extra value on top of our debt that's impacted from each of the projects. And what I've got here, guys, for you to look at later is just a listing of the projects which have currently been funded, just to give you a bit of an understanding of what's been funded. What I would make an observation of for this audience, and as I talk about the reforms, I'll try and talk about how they might adapt or be used around mining and manufacturing. Mining and resources are quite a large part of what we've done up until now. From memory, I think they're over a quarter of the book. As it stands, but we see a lot more potential to deal in that space, especially in Queensland. There's been a lot of large projects that we've funded in Western Australia. We'd like to do more in Queensland. So this audience, we're quite interested in your views. Manufacturing is a space which is obviously a great focus of the government at the moment with the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. Whilst in Canberra, admittedly, I'm here primarily because of the legislation and then Senate estimates, which is on Thursday. But I am meeting with the people running that Modern Manufacturing Initiative to look at different ways in which we can work with them. But we are keen to do more in that space, especially through the major centres of Townsville, Gladstone, Rockhampton, and Cairns, where we see great opportunity to build economic growth and population by assisting in growing what is very, very good manufacturing centres. This leads us now to the reforms. So, as I said, we've been around since 2016. We've done just under $3 billion in investment decisions. But two things have happened which have really brought about these reforms. The first was there was a statutory review into the NAIF where the government went to the community and asked, well, NAIF's operated now for a period of time. We're thinking about extending its mandate. What else could they do? What else would you like to see them do? And a whole range of stakeholders, including I mentioned RDA, and no doubt people who are on this call participated in that. And a lot of that feedback is part of these reforms. The other thing, to be frank, that happened is COVID. So COVID certainly led to the federal government having a lot more ambition in the space. And by that, they've allowed us, or are prepared to allow us, I suppose, to do a lot more than they would have if we had these reforms go through of March last year without the period we've had over the last 12 months. So this is very much a reaction to the voices of Northern Australia, but what they wanted from NAIF. Some of it, to be frank, is a learning from NAIF over its period of existence, and a lot of it is a COVID response as well. So hopefully this loosening will lead to a lot more projects and a lot more funding. So there's a number of concepts which I want to talk about when we talk about these reforms. One will be around definitions, another is around equity. But one concept which I want to introduce as a key theory is the removal of the link with construction in the NAIF Act and mandate. Now, this may sound a little bit odd, but what I'd like you to think about is in the NAIF legislation, there's a line that says NAIF funds the construction of infrastructure. What we're effectively doing is taking the word construction out. And what that means is NAIF funds infrastructure. And that's infrastructure, how we define it. I'll talk about that in a minute. But primarily, we just have to get to a point where infrastructure happens. Whether or not our action immediately leads to that construction is not the point. It's whether or not you get infrastructure at the end of the process, which is a really important principle. So at the moment, we currently do what's called project lending. If you've got a project that meets the criteria, we can lend specifically for that project. So our funding is tied to that project. Some of the changes I'll talk about now lead to infrastructure, but they will see us funding either into a company's balance sheet as part of a deal that leads to infrastructure, maybe funding through a third party in a transaction that leads to smaller transactions to bring our deal size down, or in the future, it's not something we do immediately, looking to seed funds where private investors would invest in Northern Australia, but where NAIF might provide some of that initial capital to attract it to a private structured vehicle. So the big change that I'm going to talk about now is this removal of construction. So the first point I'll talk about with this is corporate lending. So as I said, up until now, we've been able to fund at the project level. Now, under the changes, we'll be able to fund at the corporate level, or at least more efficiently at the corporate level. And that means that a whole range of things, but the simplest is that there may be projects out there or proponents who currently have a wonderful relationship with their bank, but are not, and hence project funding is not really an issue for them. But they still need some form of an incentive to either prioritise or bring forward projects in Northern Australia. What we would be prepared to do under this new structure would be to look to a corporate loan, which may introduce some debt of a longer tenor into their balance sheet, which we would imagine would be of a benefit for them. But in exchange for that, we would look for them to institute a project or number of projects in Northern Australia. Now, this could work for quite large corporates where they have the opportunity to prioritise between Northern and Southern Australia. It could also work for smaller sized entities where the opportunity exists for them to do major projects on their existing businesses. So project lending, a really interesting space for us. It's easier for us to do this. It's quicker to deal in this manner because collateral primarily is at the corporate level, not at the project level. So getting an understanding of the ins and outs of the project are less of a concern, as is getting an understanding of the business that we're lending the money to. So a different way to do risk, a different way to do a transaction. As I said, I expect it'll be speedier and quite common as we go over the next couple of years. The other thing that will be quite common, and certainly an initiative that the Minister is very keen on, is that we will get the opportunity to deal in smaller transactions. Now, at the moment, there is no minimum transaction size for NAIF, but really we lose our efficiency at about $15 to $20 million. And that's because of a range of things. We do provide concessions for sure, and certainly a whole range of benefits that I've already outlined. But we're a small team, and sometimes it costs as much to do a small deal as it does to do a large deal. And being the Commonwealth Government, we bring a whole range of different tests that people have to pass to get the transaction to work. So it's worth it over 15 to 20 million, and under that at the moment, we sort of discourage people because we don't think they get the benefit out of it. What we can do, however, is deal with a third party and aggregate. And when we deal with a third party and aggregate, and a third party could be a commercial bank, or it could be an entity like a QRA or another sort of state government sort of organisation, where we would lend them the money, where we would undertake a lot of the requirements of us being a Commonwealth Government lender at that higher level. And they'd also provide us with a back office, which is used to dealing in smaller transactions. The Minister's goal is we get these transactions down to $1 million in loan size. And that's certainly something we think we can achieve through these aggregation strategies. So expect to see us looking at different partners who currently run loan programs in your communities and seeing if they might be willing to partner with us in order to meet our policy initiatives through aggregating some of our funding. The other point that I mentioned that the divorce with construction gives us is the ability in time to attract private sector funders in the form of funds to invest in Northern Australia along the same mandate that we use as NAIF, and we may seed those funds with some of our funding. That would be just us trying to attract more money to the area and more money to our mission, which is jobs and economic growth in Northern Australia. That's not something we'll do in the initial phases. To be frank, some of this other stuff is taking more than enough time to work out, but in time we'll be able to do that, and we think that'll be quite interesting. The next change we'll talk about is equity, which is quite interesting. So I mentioned we had a $5 billion allocation. Under these changes, up to $500 million of that, or 10%, will be able to be converted to equity. The rules around that would be that individual and equity investments will be no larger than $50 million, and the Commonwealth or NAIF is not allowed to have a majority or a controlling position in those investments. It may be the case that this is someone where we're also providing debt, but then again, it may not be the case. It may be the situation that the best way in which we can get the project to work is by NAIF being involved as equity. This is a big change for us. I mean, what equity is and a whole range of things is it helps deal with a whole range of projects where debt is not the problem, the need for equity is the problem. So it allows us to play in that space and broadens the scope of what we can do. It also, equity is a higher risk instrument than debt. So those people who thought that NAIF should take more risk, and I must tell you, a lot of our debt is at the higher end of risk for debt, equity is the tool which will allow us to do that. But I must say, we're in the process of employing an equity team, and we really want to make this into something that makes a difference to those projects which are transformational, not just because of their massive size, but because transformational projects can be smaller that still make a massive difference to communities and to certain industries. So we're very much looking forward to the situation where we could be involved in equity investments, driving projects in both the mining and the manufacturing space. The next part of the reforms, which I think is quite interesting, is around infrastructure. NAIF had a change to its act and mandate in 2018. Up until that point, there was a very, very restrictive definition of what infrastructure was. Primarily, there was a view that NAIF would invest in 5 $1 billion projects, and they would be very strictly infrastructure, like bridges and roads and power lines and the like, and nothing outside that. After 2018, there was a certain migration of projects into areas that more facilitated private sector investment and development, and that's been really successful for NAIF and I think for the proponents that have come to us. These reforms extend on that definition even further. So the definition of physical infrastructure is there must be physical infrastructure, or infrastructure that's defined as there must be something physical that's infrastructure, but infrastructure in our definition is anything else that economically enables that piece of infrastructure. So a good definition of that is that many of you would be aware that we funded or we are currently funding an abattoir in Claremont. Before 2018, we couldn't have done that transaction under that old definition of infrastructure. What we could do under the current definition is the fixed structure and the equipment that's fixed again within the facility. Under this new definition of infrastructure, we could do the non-fixed equipment. We could do trucks to bring the cattle to the abattoir. We could do trucks to take the meat away from the abattoir. We could train the staff. We could do software that runs the equipment. So a whole range of different things which don't meet the traditional understanding of infrastructure, but which would be able to enable, and I say economically enable that piece of infrastructure. In the mining and manufacturing space, I think there's enormous ways in which this new definition can be applied, especially around the ideas of using IT systems and training to better enable that the pieces of infrastructure which have been put into a system, whether that's a manufacturing system or a mining system. In some ways, this definition is best looked at by what it's not. It's not anything that looks like working capital, and it's not land if land is not something that's critical to the project. But very much else, it's everything that contributes to the economic performance of that asset. The other thing we've done to make things a bit easier is we've refined the definition of public benefit. And by that, we've had previously used the traditional definition of public benefit, where often analysis has been required to work out how a project has impacted across a region or community. For most small and medium-sized players in the market now, or at least who'll come to us, public benefit will be, can you create jobs and economic growth? And if you can do that, you'll meet the definition of public benefit. Obviously, the more jobs and economic growth you can provide, the more that we'll be able to provide a concession, and more interested we will be in trying to get that project to happen, and the more tools we'll be able to apply. But public benefit is narrowed and made substantially simpler. One thing we're trying to work out internally is, as you get larger, obviously we'll need more substance around the claims for jobs and economic growth. So how we do that, we are still working on. But the important point in this is we've greatly simplified the definition. And finally, something which is probably not relevant to most players here, but due to a quirk in the Constitution, it has been the case that we now lend all of our money to the states, and they then on-loan it to the project. We have fantastic relationships with our state partners. There's been some trials over the past, but over the last 12 to 18 months, everyone has been working hard along the same sort of, towards the same goals, and we very much appreciate it. But it is another process, and it does add some time to the time frame of us administering NAIF funding. So the federal government has allowed us to use some of the powers around the corporation's power, or the trade between the states power, or the treaty's power, to deal directly with proponents in certain circumstances. We're still working on that, both with the federal government and with our state partners, to work out how that would work. But what I can say is we'll bring some substantial efficiencies to the NAIF process, which I think will be appreciated by all. Everybody, I think I've finished there. If I look at my watch, I think I'm right on half an hour, including what Glennis's presentation, which leaves us half an hour for questions, which everybody I'm very much looking forward to. So Glennis, over to you for moderation.
Right. Thank you for that. And what I'll do is maybe if I'll get you to maybe take your screen off, and we can see our faces here for everyone. So it's great to have, I think it's about 25 or so people on board at the moment. So it's great to have you all here from across the north in particular. So if there are any questions, we'd love to see them now. I'm sure you're just consuming a lot of that information from Gerard. But from my perspective, just to kick things off, you know, I guess that we're looking at our industries here today, mining and manufacturing. Yesterday we looked at agriculture. How are you seeing the pipeline of the interest coming through to you, Gerard? Are you seeing a high level of inquiry, or you're looking to see more level of inquiry? And maybe a question about the timelines and processes for going through that initial conversation through to fruition.
No troubles at all. The pipeline in both projects, both areas, is interesting. In the resource sector, we have and have always had a very strong pipeline. What I mentioned before, though, is a bit of a challenge for us. I feel that WA has been stronger, has always been stronger for us than it has been in Queensland. One thing we really do want to build out is that Queensland mining pipeline. So very interested to hear from people on the call about different projects and ideas they have, either on this call or if they wish to catch up later. So pipeline is strong, but there's I think some regional divergence in that pipeline. Manufacturing is a Queensland story. Oh, well, I shouldn't be too controversial. I mean, manufacturing exists across the whole area, but there are some very important manufacturing centres in Queensland. I mentioned them. It's Townsville, it's Gladstone, it's Rockhampton, it's Cairns. It's a number of those other regional cities which have very strong manufacturing bases, often related to the mining industry. We have not had the strength that we'd like in that space, and hence we are still very interested in tying ourselves to some of the current federal government programs and partnering with them to continue to build that space. Because we think, especially along the coast of Queensland, there are a number of opportunities for us to play a very positive role in developing manufacturing businesses. So that's something we're quite keen to look at. The aggregation piece, which I mentioned, is something which we'll start with on an all-comers basis. And, you know, it's a new policy for us. So we need to become comfortable with it. But after we do become comfortable with it, it may be something that we look to partner with state and federal government on to target specific ideas and areas. I mentioned that when we talked about agriculture last night, and manufacturing would be something else we'd look to try and assist in time. But that's very much in time. We have to walk before we can run. As far as timeframes go, I might just talk a bit about the process. I talked about investment decisions before, and I also talked about contractual close. What we've got in our process is, like all entities like us, we've got a very long pipeline of people that we're talking to, and we're very happy to talk to people as they develop their project. One thing to remember about us is we sit in a different space as far as the Northern Australian financing infrastructure is. We're not grant, so we need to get to a certain point to guarantee the taxpayer that we can get their money back. So I talk to people about debt, which will still be the majority of our portfolio, is defined in the accountant's definitions as a better than 50% chance of getting the money back. And we go through a process where we have to prove that for our debt to an independent party who's a chief credit officer. Now, the process we go through to do that is that there's a whole heap of people working through their projects in a pipeline. As they get to a point where both ourselves and them believe that they're about to get to a point where they can prove the case with us as a partner to our board and to our chief credit officer that they will fit the NAIF mandate and that the taxpayer is getting a good deal, then we go through what's called a strategic assessment paper. A strategic assessment paper is considered by our board, and it effectively provides the okay for NAIF to spend money doing due diligence on that project. That due diligence leads us to an investment decision, which I said is an offer of funding to a project, which will have a number of conditions which need to be worked through to get to contractual close. At contractual close, both parties are contracted to each other, and we call that the point of economic enablement, because more often than not, to be frank, that's when money starts to get spent by the proponent as they start to use their equity to do early works and design and those sorts of things. And then after that, we get to financial close when money starts flowing, but that's more of an incidental factor. How long does that take? Well, for CQ University, it took us about 3 months to get from strategic assessment to financial close. The process has gotten quicker over the last 12 months. 3 months was probably excessively quick, but 4 to 5 months is certainly very doable. The challenges to that process, when we blow out the timelines, are making sure that the process of due diligence is carried out effectively and efficiently, and that's all about the exchange of information. And sometimes, you know, there'll be questions that people need to go away and work out how to answer. So, you know, that'll take some time. I mentioned there is a state process that fits in between investment decision and contractual close. As I said strongly, we're both working as hard as we can, and I think with goodwill and spirit, but it's another process. So we do have to go through that, and that takes a little bit of time. But I think 4 to 5 months on a standard project is about the right time frame.
Thank you. And I think that's answered a question for Stephen Grocott as well that's come up. I'd like to move to a question now from Stephen Wilmot. His question is that given that NAIF can now do equity funding, does that mean that it is no longer thought of as that it is now thought of no longer, sorry, Stephen, I'm mixing up your words there. Given that NAIF can do equity funding, does that mean it's no longer thought of as a gap funder, or in other words, can NAIF be the first or early to commit to funding rather than waiting for others to be in first place?
The answer to that is, I think that Stephen's onto a very good point here. So well done, Stephen. It's a very good question. With those original tools which I talked about, where we've evolved that over the last 18 months is if the project meets the mandate, then we're basically prepared to work with the proponent to come up with the structure which best has the best chance of delivering the project. With equity, we would use the same principles. So it is about coming up with the structure or arrangement which is the best chance to deliver the project. If that means then that we come in earlier and that is used to attract other people, so the term gap funder in my mind is always a little bit mute, because which gap are you filling? But if it is the case that we come in first, that we show some support from a government entity to a project, and that is seen as being important to attract other people to the transaction, other equity holders and debt holders to the transaction, we would be very open-minded to that. All this will depend as we work through scenarios, but we certainly don't see ourselves as just coming in at the end. We certainly don't see ourselves just coming in to fill a gap because others can't. We see ourselves coming up with the solution that best gets us the project. So we are happy to structure that with the proponent, and the timing will be decided by that. So good question, Stephen. You're right. We are moving away from the gap piece to being whatever gets us the deal.
We have an anonymous one here. I'll be trying to guess who it is, but it does relate to defence. It's a good one with a government focus on sovereign defence industry capability and a desire for establishing a strong presence, particularly in Townsville. Do you feel investment in facilities and business developments in this space would be considered by NAIF?
Yes, it's a key interest of ours. The anonymous questioner is right to in the statement they make around Defence's interests throughout our mandate area, but most specifically for this audience in Townsville. But what is really important in Defence is that it gives us as NAIF the opportunity to have a big customer that can be that is almost like a guaranteed customer. So in a whole range of different areas, if there's a Defence flavour to it, it helps us to do projects in areas which the project can be reasonably difficult. An example of that would be, even though there's no contractual relationships between Defence and the Northern Territory government, but people will be aware that we're funding a ship lift in the Northern Territory, basically to lift larger boats of the size of the new patrol boat out of the water in Darwin. Now, that will have a whole range of application across maritime industries in Darwin, fishing fleets and pearling fleets and transport fleets. But the fact that Defence is there is very important to that project and helps us look at a customer, as again, I said, is reliable because of what's going on in a strategic sense. So we can do things which are directly related to Defence. That's really interesting to us, but it also helps us deliver a whole range of other projects, especially in areas like ports.
I've got one from Ian Neal, and it's I'm reading from Ian's question here. He's in the process of setting a project up with a product that needs to be injected and moulded, and he has to go to Brisbane for that work, and it would create about 45 jobs in Brisbane, as there's no one able to do that here in North Queensland. There are a lot of companies similarly doing this to go to Brisbane for this process. Would a project like this be something that NAIF would look at to get the manufacturing project up and going in Townsville? Yeah,
we'd love to have a look at that. I mean, from what's outlined there, it's interesting. It identifies a need. There's obviously quite a bit of thinking going in behind it. So yeah, we'd love to hear that story. So if the Ian would like to leave his details or make contact through yourself, Glenys, we'd be more than happy to have that conversation.
That'd be great. There's certainly projects that we like to support, like bring those jobs into the region. We have another question from Stephen Grocott, and can a number of geographically close project proponents combine in a single NAIF infrastructure application, e.g. road, power supply, gas supply, etc., that enables more than one project?
Yes, they can. There's an interesting project in the north of WA where it's ended up with Alinta as being the owner, but the people who brought that one together was Fortescue and Gina Reinhardt's operations. So what you've got there is a shared electricity asset. Now, there was a whole range of negotiations about how to bring that together. It's ended up with Alinta owning the asset, but it could have turned out other ways with other structures to share the infrastructure, whether that's a combined ownership structure or something along those lines. So we quite like that as a concept. And what you'd do there is you'd share the risk between a number of parties as well, which would be appealing to us. So no, very much like that as an idea.
Great, excellent. Now we have a question from Dwayne Woodbury. On the equity investment, will it be the same due diligence and execution team to make both a debt and equity decision, or will there be separate teams and processes?
Again, a very good question. The first thing that I'd say is we're currently building an equity team, which will be the core of our thinking in that space. So that will be people who will be able not only to make those judgments in their own right, but also to help bring forward a number of our current debt players so that they can operate in that equity space as well. So we are both bringing on a defined equity capability, but upskilling our current workforce to make sure that they can all do that. Now, as far as how it would be considered, you would have to go through a similar process to what we do with debt. Obviously, we're coming from a different angle, and people who do debt behave in different ways to people who do equity. I mean, in equity, you have to pay for your own lawyers and those sorts of consultants and those sorts of things. So there would be some variances in that. But the concept that we would basically go through a strategic assessment process with our board to okay investigation, that would be right. And then there'd be an extensive period of due diligence after that and an investment decision. So parts of that will look the same as debt. As far as if there were two teams, we would probably, and we are still working on this as a concept, my understanding is we'd probably like to keep some form of separation there, just because, yeah, just so that there's not too much mixing between a debt and an equity decision. So we would provide some separation between the two teams if debt and equity was being provided at the same time.
Good, thank you. Please feel free, everyone, to keep sending questions through. I've got one for you. It's a little bit left field of mining and manufacturing, but our local governments are highly supportive of all their industries and job creation. Are local governments able to be an applicant to NAIF, and if so, are you seeing any interest from them in driving any locally based projects?
That's another good question. And technically, no, there is no restriction on us dealing with local governments. And we have had some reasonably extensive conversations both in Queensland and other jurisdictions. They are yet to have led to a transaction. One point that we need to work with more actively with the state of Queensland is around local governments and their relationship with Queensland Treasury Corporation. Queensland Treasury Corporation does keep a very tight rein on a whole range of entities within the Queensland government orbit, of which local government is one. We could offer a range of different products, being the Commonwealth, to local governments, but we would need to negotiate that with Queensland Treasury Corporation. And as of yet, that structure hasn't really been, we haven't come to a structure that would work for both parties. So we could, technically, we are very interested in the idea. The key for us, though, is coming up with a structure that works for ourselves and Queensland Treasury Corporation.
Any other questions coming in? I have seemed to come to the bottom of questions. I'm just reading chat as well to make sure any have slipped in there. Don't seem to have any new ones coming up at the moment.
One thing I thought when I finished the presentations, I should have just, I meant to, but whenever you do these things, you sort of, you move between things and you may not add the points you wanted to. I mean, the corporate lending I mentioned broadly and its implications for us as far as projects and different examples go. Just to make those examples a little bit more relevant to mining and manufacturing people, what we would have there is a situation where you might have, in a mining sense, an existing mine operator, and it may have a series of upgrades or new developments that it would like to bring to pass. It may, obviously those new developments would lead to an increase of employment and economic growth within the region. And it may also be, and this is just an option, that maybe some of those some of those ideas, that pipeline of development which they have, don't meet, wouldn't be project fundable, or the banks may not be interested in project funding that for whatever reason. That is a situation where our corporate debt capacity would be very relevant, especially if we were convinced that we would be bringing forward development, which would not otherwise have happened in that time frame. So there's a whole range of opportunities, especially with commodity prices being quite strong, where that may be relevant to mining participants. Similarly, with manufacturers, you may have an existing manufacturing business. That manufacturing business may wish to expand, and it may wish to go to an expansion which has a higher level of risk to it, which is not, again, project fundable. It may be that the corporate lending avenue provides us with opportunities in that space to be of assistance. Again, especially if we were to be of a mind that this was bringing forward jobs and economic growth, which otherwise would be delayed.
We now have a question from Nick Elliott, and he asks, with the recent launch of the Manufacturing Modernisation Initiative, the Australian government's focus on modern manufacturing, will NAIF give a preference to projects aligned with this initiative?
I'd prefer to look at it as we'd like to work in partnership with that initiative rather than a preference. It's funny how this works with NAIF. I talked about the process. One thing we've never done, and I don't think we ever will do, is that as long as you meet the criteria, we don't say, oh, we've got too much of X, or we prefer the project in Townsville to the project in Gladstone, or we prefer, to do stuff in the Northern Territory than Western Australia. So for most of that space, we just don't have a preference generally. So you're not disadvantaged if you're not part of the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. We would like to be partners with the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, because one issue that we face, I think, is, I talked about the ecosystem for funding a project, and where we sit in that ecosystem is that we've got debt and we've got equity. And the key things to think about with that is we need to get that back. I mean, the taxpayer expects us to get our debt repaid and for them to get their equity returned. Further down the risk spectrum from us is grant funding and development equity funding, which even with all of these changes, we can't do, but others can. And what appeals to me about things like the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, the state government's Jobs and Regional Growth Program, there's the fund they're running through QIC, I think the Queensland Business Fund, or other entities around there, is whether or not those grant and equity programs can help projects come to the point where they are suitable for NAIF's funding streams. So that's why we want to work with Modern Manufacturing Initiative to bring projects forward so that we can do more, but you're not advantaged or disadvantaged by a relationship with them.
I don't think we've got any more questions there from the floor at the moment. Jared, was there anything from yesterday's webinar and discussion that you think might be interesting to today's audience as well? There are quite a few questions yesterday. Is there anything in particular that you wanted to share from that? Stretching our memory to yesterday.
Yeah, let me think broadly. So some of the questions we had the equity question, which we've covered here. We had a little bit more of a drill down on aggregation. I think aggregation has a really direct and immediate reference, even in an all-comers environment, to agriculture. It's been a challenge to us. I mentioned our want to do more in manufacturing. There's definitely a want to do more in agriculture. And a challenge there has been the smaller deal size. So to get those deal sizes smaller, I think will be quite useful in that space. I think there'll be a real application for that in manufacturing as well. I think that's the space, broader than mining, will be where aggregation is very helpful. Also discussed yesterday, I suppose, were some of the different types of product as far as what types of things fit the infrastructure definition. As I talked about earlier in the talk, I mean, the infrastructure definition and the broadening of that, I think, is an enormous application to mining and manufacturing. Indeed, both those areas, as much as anything, it's about all that other stuff that comes with infrastructure to make it work, being important. I think it's great for us to be able to be end-to-end in that process. So certainly there were some questions about the definition, and I think this audience very much benefits from that. The final points that were talked about that I can remember from the piece was whether or not the how NAIF fits in sort of like the risk orbit for things, and whether or not we are taking more risks. And we are because of equity. Equity is a higher risk product than debt. The important point is that will be really, really useful for us. It doesn't take us in that development equity space, doesn't take it in that grant space, but still very, very good product for us. But I think other than that, Glenys, we have covered the points that were raised yesterday.
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, thanks, Jared. I think that's been really helpful and a broad range of questions, and really appreciate that from our audience today, and we hope that has helped you directly. I'll just share a screen with you for more contact details in the end. If you would like to contact RDA or keep in touch with us, here are our details. So you can see there, we put information up for those who are interested in grants. We post regularly on Facebook and LinkedIn, and also distribute our own community connections newsletters and news flashes. If you've got any specific questions and you'd like me to link up with Gerard and the team, just shoot us an email there, and we'll quickly support you in linking you through to NAIF and the relevant people there, and making sure you can have detailed discussions in confidence there. But hopefully that is of help to you. Also, just a plug, we've also started recently producing a quarterly economic update from our region. The most recent one was issued in February, and we'll have another one coming up fairly soon. So if you'd also like to register for that, just shoot us an email, or you can do that online on our website. So thank you, Jared. Your time has been incredibly helpful to us, I believe, and our region, and more broadly. And we'd like to thank you for your time and effort, and certainly to all our audience, thank you for joining us this morning. It's been great to have you online, and we hope that you have got some valuable information to assist you with considering NAIF as an option for you going forward in your expansion or new investments in the region. So from RDA, thank you very much for your time. We look forward to doing further webinars as appropriate, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.